killed in a dastardly terrorist attack back in the 80s, some would have us believe that the way to deal with this terrorist organization is to engage and negotiate with them and to give them legitimacy. Also a fact, Hamas, the organization that violently took over the Gaza Strip, is defined by the State Department and by the European Union as a terrorist organization. It is a fact that Hamas's charter still calls for the destruction of the United Nations member state, the Jewish state of Israel. It doesn't call for the establishment of a Palestinian state alongside Israel. It calls for the destruction of the Jewish state of Israel. Hamas itself is also anti-West, as well as being anti-Israel, and Hamas, in a violation of all of the laws of war and the United Nations Charter, as well as the Geneva Convention, holds till today, after 4+ years, Gilad Shalit, a soldier who was kidnapped in a raid through a tunnel under the border between Gaza and Israel, kidnapped from his army base while not in the midst of operational activity, held till today with nary a visit by the Red Cross, with no contact with any international organization, and with no contact and no visitation rights by his family or any others. These are facts which it's important to recognize, to accept, and to acknowledge if you want to understand what's going on today in the Middle East. One other fact to share with you. People talk about a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Let there be no mistake. Palestinians in Gaza do live in relative poor conditions. And I would not want to live as a Palestinian in Gaza. But guess what? Ironically enough, given that that flotilla that Richard mentioned came from and was supported by the Turkish government, the living standard of your average Palestinian in Gaza, when measured in terms of gross domestic product, when measured in terms of lifespan, longevity, when measured in terms of infant mortality rates, is better than your average Turkish citizen. Not to mention Somalians, Sudanese, and many others who live in abject poverty around the world. I'm not suggesting that it's fun to be a Palestinian in Gaza. I'm sharing with you the fact that there is no humanitarian crisis in Gaza today, as acknowledged by, most recently, a relatively, shall we say, pro-Palestinian columnist from the New York Times, in addition to Tony Blair and the United Nations rapporteur in Gaza. These facts are very important to understand where Israel's coming from. I want to share with you 3 other very specific facts, if you will, which then lead me to a number of different suggestions for American government policy, as well as for yourselves, in terms of your conversations with your friends and neighbors, your political activism with either local politicians like Pete, or with regional or state or even national politicians, as well as with the media, because it's understanding these facts that will enable us to argue cogently for reasonable and effective policies with regard to the predicament that is the conflict in the Middle East. Fact number 1, international law is clear. Let no one argue with you. Politicians, academics, and intellectuals may claim a number of different elements or different ideas with regard to the situation in the Middle East, but never let them use the term legality or international law to bolster those claims. Let me again be clear. Reasonable people can disagree about policy with regard to the Middle East. And reasonable people, liberal or conservative, right-wing or left-wing in Israel or America, can disagree about what should be done about the Palestinians, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the like. But when one of those people propagandistically suggests that Israel's defensive military operations are in some way against international law or international humanitarian law, there is no basis for that. When one suggests that Israel's response to the flotilla, as Richard mentioned, was in some way disproportionate or illegal, there is nothing illegal about the maritime blockade that Israel has instigated against the hostile regime that took over Gaza. It is a military and political technique used, whether by the British in the Falklands, by the Americans and the Allies against Iraq, by John Kennedy against Cuba, and one of the mechanisms being discussed to be used against Iran today. A maritime blockade is a legitimate act which helps a government in a very passive way, not an active way, but a passive way, to defend its citizens. There is nothing illegal about it. The same must be said about Israel's presence in the disputed territories. Yes, there is a debate, and yes, most of the politicians in the world believe that Israel should leave those territories in favor of the establishment of a Palestinian state. I may even agree to that construct. The Prime Minister of Israel has agreed to that construct, as long as that Palestinian state doesn't threaten Israel and its citizens. But this has nothing to do with the law. And to understand the mood today in Israel and the policies of the Israeli government, which promote the thriving and building of those communities in Judea and Samaria, in the heartland of the land of Israel, what are known as the West Bank or the disputed territories, one must understand that the legal situation is not complex. It is clear that the San Remo Convention, as from 1920, as well as the mandate given by the League of Nations to the British government in 1922, which was accepted by the United Nations when it took over responsibility for these issues from the League of Nations, was never abrogated. So politically there are those who suggest that Israel's presence in the territories is not helpful or is wrong. But those who claim that it's illegal have no leg to stand on. And understanding that indisputable fact helps us to understand why it is that Israel today is so united in our appreciation of the importance of our right to defend ourselves. We are not united when it comes to a question of whether we should or shouldn't continue the temporary 10-month freeze of building of the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. That we are not united on. In fact, ironically enough, we're not united on whether or not Israel should or shouldn't dismantle some of those communities in the context of a peace agreement with the Palestinians. What is less well known is we are united when understanding the right that we have to be there in those territories. The only difference between left and right in Israel, and this you should understand, is that the left believes that even though we have a right to be there, both present militarily as well as with our Jewish communities there, that we ought to relinquish that right in favor of a Palestinian establishment of a Palestinian state. Whereas the right wing in Israel believes that we should bolster that right and actualize that right and continue to build new communities and expand the existing communities. But never forget that the concept that the Jews have a connection to this land, the land of Israel, the land of our ancestors, is something that we are unified in understanding. And this is why I think it's important to recognize, if you ask for an understanding of the state of Israel, as Richard did, the situation that's currently, today, present in Israel, we have an incredibly unified body politic around a number of specific and explicit concepts, which if you understand these, you can become both more informed and more proactive, whether it's politically or with the media, in helping to support what it is that Israel stands for and what we believe, or I should say I believe, can be the most productive contribution by America towards peace in the region. Number one, we have to recognize that the pundits and the academics and the politicians in Europe, and unfortunately more and more even here in America, are simply wrong in their focus as well as their theoretical approach and often in their language. They're wrong in their focus by promoting continually the idea that Israel is somehow the responsible party for the lack of peace in the Middle East. It's like suggesting that Cary Grant is responsible for oppressing the residents of, I forget the name of the town that High Noon takes place in. The fact is,